Hey guys, welcome back. So now once again, we're jumping back into Venom. And just as a reminder, for anyone who's new here, we're 13 toes deep. So make sure you caught up before we get into this discussion, because at this point, the story is just rolling. And the events that we see take place here for Eddie are just taking him right into the new Dark Web event coming in December. So with that said, let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so with this one, we jump back in just after our previous talk when we'd seen Sleeper activate a Sleeper agent, Hank Hensley, in order to get Dylan's body back to the Venom symbiote, which like we'd seen, this whole ordeal had taken Dylan to the next level, to the next phase, and to his next name. And once again, I can't stress enough how much this reminds me of the changes that we're seeing take place with Eddie Brock, which are gradually transforming him into Meridius. Because now with us seeing Dylan's change, I wouldn't be surprised if he was on a 7-step program as well, which will then take Dylan to who knows where. But with these events that we're getting into, with them leading us into Dark Web, we should be getting a better understanding, hopefully in December when the event starts, but hopefully around that time we'll get a bit more information as far as where things are heading for Dylan. But for this one, we head back over to the future, in the Garden of Meridius, with Finnegan, who is Eddie Brock 2.0. And after his violent encounter with Bedlam, Finnegan finds himself looking to the skies in this garden, and there's so much going through his mind right now. Cause for one, he don't even know if the sky is real, cause for all he knows, it could just be symbiote matter, like the rest of this garden. But with them saying this on this symbiote mountaintop, it's almost like it's in this moment where Eddie really takes in the idea that his future self is going to kill every symbiote left and build this massive cage the size of a world. And it's almost like it's right now with the scope of this, it sinks in and it's freaking him out. Because again, this is just moments after he saw his future self kill his son. So again, he's freaking out, he's on edge. But then it's here where Finnegan, who is Eddie 2.0, is met by the arrival of Wild, who is Eddie 4.0. And unlike Finnegan, Wild, he's more of a joker, because after the Finnegan stage, which is fear and confusion, you then had the Bedlam stage, which is rage. But then after rage, there's Wild, who at that point for Eddie, he's a bit sarcastic, crass, and he just makes a joke out of everything. So when Wild gets here and he tells Finnegan that it could be worse, at least it's not raining, and just right away, Finnegan loses it. And it's not only because Wild is joking about the matter, but it's also because Wild had already been Bedlam. So it's like Wild had already killed Dylan. And Wild argues that he doesn't understand why Finnegan's so mad, because he's gonna eventually do this. And when Wild says this, Finnegan then tears him in half. And with doing so, his rage then begins to turn him into Bedlam. But with noticing this, Finnegan then starts to calm himself down because he doesn't want to turn into Bedlam because he doesn't want to kill Dylan. And Finnegan knows that one just leads to the next. But as soon as he gathers himself and comes back down from nearly becoming Bedlam, it's here where Wild then tells Finnegan what we already know, which is Dylan's not dead. And with saying this, Wild recalls when he was Bedlam, and he remembers stabbing Dylan, but he also remembers that at the time when he was Bedlam, he knew that it wouldn't kill Dylan, because before Bedlam stabbed Dylan, he had already seen future Dylan alive, which is part of the reason why he went ahead and did it, because he believed that the pain would make Dylan stronger. And his hero Wild reminds poor Finnegan that time for them is not linear. But through the course of this conversation, there are a number of things that Wild points out to his earlier self Finnegan, while also explaining that certain things just made sense to him at the time. And it's kind of crazy because some of the things that Wild is telling his earlier self, these things are feeding into his own transformation. Because in the larger picture, for Eddie, when he goes from Finnegan to Bedlam, he now knows that Dylan's not going to die because his future self told him. And even furthermore, when Bedlam runs into Codex, which is the next stage of Dylan, it'll confirm for Bedlam even the more that Dylan's going to make it and he's going to come out even more powerful. So keep in mind everything that Wild is sharing here. And really this whole interaction with Finnegan in itself is pushing the both of them to their next stage. Because also in this conversation, Wild tells Finnegan that he's not trapped here. And as soon as Wild says this, much like most of what he's sharing here, he realizes what this is doing. Because with Wild sharing this information, he knows what Finnegan's gonna do with it. Because it's from here where Finnegan begs to know how. And he more or less threatens Wild, but Wild understands that there's nothing that Finnegan can really do because he's barely holding himself together. And even if he tears Wild to pieces, he'll just bring himself back together. But regardless, Wild, he tells Finnegan anyway. And he lets him know that he's a king in black. So not only can he transfer himself back and forth through time into another Clintar, but he can move himself in any direction, even in the present. And with hearing this, it takes Finnegan a minute to figure it out, because like we'd seen before, Meridius had built this garden after killing every symbiote that was left. But even still, that's not every symbiote. And as soon as Finnegan gets this, he's out. But with Finnegan leaving, it's here where Wild regrets not keeping his mouth shut. And when that regret hits, he no longer sees the humor in all of this, because this was the way that it was always gonna go. And it's here where he turns into Tyro, who now is the version of Eddie who desires to learn as much as possible from Meridius, to where from here, Tyro will eventually become Meridius. But it's after this where we then jump to Finnegan, and we find that he's jumped to a completely different dimension, which is also the closest neighboring dimension. That just happens to be Limbo. But with Finnegan arriving here, he finds himself within a sample of symbiote matter. And we quickly find out that the way that this symbiote is even possible for Eddie to jump into, or Finnegan to jump into, is because some time ago this symbiote matter was fished from Earthrealm and is considered very valuable due to its rarity. But with Eddie finding himself here, and I'm just gonna call him Eddie for this one, or at least at this point until we get back to the multiple Eddie territory, because it's really in those cases where I want to separate the identities, but for now, while it's only him, I'ma just call him Eddie. But with him finding himself here, he manages to break out of this conical flask only to get shot at by a demon alchemist who's yelling at his apprentice while doing so. But as Eddie evades getting scorched, he tries to communicate with this symbiote and get to know who it is, only to then get no response, which right there just lets him know that nobody's home. But then to get out of this, Eddie says to himself that it's not about the size of the symbiote, but it's where you stick it. And with him saying this, he then goes down the dude's throat, only to then jump out of his eyeball. And I'm gonna tell you right now, I don't condone this behavior. Eddie is wilding right now. But after doing this, Eddie then more or less strikes a deal with the apprentice, because he lets him know if he doesn't get any funny ideas, he'll be able to keep his insides on the inside. And it's from here where he gets the apprentice to use a spell to make him 9 feet tall again, or at least as close to that as the apprentice is able to do. And before Eddie leaves, in return, he then gives the apprentice a piece of the symbiote as more or less a tip just before Eddie flies out of here and goes on about his way. But I also gotta say, with all of this happening and Eddie being in Limbo, as well as us knowing that Eddie is soon going to become Bedlam, we're aware that it's likely at some point while he's in Limbo, we're likely gonna see the beginning of the Bedlam child symbiote, which probably will happen during Dark Web, or later we may find out that the piece of this symbiote that he had just given away just may very well be that symbiote. But really the only way I could see that working is if you take what we'd seen in Thor issues 27 and 28, and you say that Eddie at the time, who was actually Meridius, had been telling a skewed version of the truth, so he might see Eddie as Bedlam at this time after his conversation with Wild, even though the current Eddie that we're following doesn't see himself as Bedlam yet. And that could be what we get down the line, but personally, I hope not, because I think it would be more consistent to have Bedlam first, all big red and rageful, and have that truly be the beginning of Big Red. Because the moment we saw Wild become Tyro, it changed him physically. So I hope we get the same going from Finnegan to Bedlam, so the other symbiote he left off just gets a whole nother story of its own. But with Eddie soon leaving their lab, he then finds himself under fire, literally, by fire arrows that are being held from a group of goblins who are escorting their regal mistress. But Eddie then quickly catches them by making a symbiote Captain America shield and then whipping them right back at these guys. And as soon as those arrows come back, these guys fall all the way back. And then for the 2 large ones who are carrying the regal mistress, Eddie then takes them out pretty quick by covering one of them with himself and using him to beat up the other guy. And after that, he just suffocates the guy that he'd bonded with, to where then the situation is pretty much handled. And after doing this, he then asks the regal mistress if she wants a piece of him too. And in response, she says yes as she steps out, and Eddie finds that it is Empyre, the Goblin Queen of Limbo. But from here, not only does she tell Eddie that they need to get to know each other a bit better, but also she believes that Eddie has something in common with a friend of hers, and she believes that they can help each other. But even with her saying this, at this point, Eddie, he's trying to get out of Limbo because he really wants to get back to his son Dylan. But as we know, with what Eddie wants and where this is really gonna go, those are 2 different things. Because with us knowing what lies ahead for Eddie, as well as this issue leading into Dark Web, at some point in the near future, Eddie's gonna go through a number of events that are going to lead to his rage getting the best of him. And I'm excited for seeing how exactly that's gonna play out. And as far as Dark Web, it's tough to say whether it's going to be a good event or not, but nonetheless, I'ma follow it for the sake of keeping up with Eddie and Dylan's story. As well as the rumors of Empyre getting revenge on Cyclops for leaving her, because I gotta see that. And not to mention, a few of you guys have been asking me for a good minute if I'm gonna pick it up, and the answer is yes, absolutely, but it's totally up to you guys if you want me to cover it on the channel. And if you do, just let me know down in the comments. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below to where you can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.